everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm so glad to have you joining me today. My name is Cyndy McDonald. I am an educator, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm a producer. I've been doing these Friday forums for over 5 years now. So it's an opportunity for me to bring to you guests who can give you information on topics that you really care about. So subject matter experts on subjects that you care about. And I have the best audience, and I have the best guests, and I have a great guest today, Murphy Miller. Thank you for being here today. Murphy is with NACAC, and he has a very special title. He leads the membership experience and global engagement at National Association for College Admission Counselors, which we often call NACAC, which has a conference coming up really quick. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be at, but I know everybody else in the world is going to be there, Murphy. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Cindy. This is a great opportunity. I'm so glad to be with you again, because we've actually done this presentation together before in person at HECA, which was so fun, which led to this opportunity. So thank you for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Very glad to be with you all today. Again, my name is Murphy Miller, and I am the Director of Membership Experience and Global Engagement for the National Association for College Admission Counseling. I come to this work having worked in college admission counseling for a number of years. I worked in undergraduate admissions for 3 different universities, Pitzer College, Savannah College of Art and Design, and the George Washington University. I then transitioned over to working on the counseling side. I was based in London, United Kingdom, and I helped students from across Europe apply to mostly US universities. And now I work here at NACAC, where I get to infuse my experience as a practitioner, as a college admission counseling professional, into my work at NACAC. And at NACAC, I'm really focused on ensuring that our 28,000 members feel supported and seen and heard. We really want NACAC to be your professional home, regardless of what side of the desk you work on. We want you to see NACAC as a resource and as a community, and as a place to get data and insights and information. So that is my role, is ensuring that we're providing all of that, and that everything that we do is through a member lens. I also spearhead a number of international initiatives. So that's why global engagement is a part of my title. We also, we serve members across 65 different countries. And so we're very aware that we don't just serve folks in the United States, we serve folks all over the world. So we try to create programming that is appropriate for that audience, and I help to promote and create that. And I also spearhead our global universities fairs, which are NACAC fairs, but those that take place outside of the United States. So I'm actually just recently back from a trip to India, where we hosted an inaugural event in Delhi. So that's a little bit about my role at NACAC. I will certainly be at our conference in a couple of weeks, doing a bunch of different things. If you are coming to conference, you're likely to find me in the NACAC booth on the expo hall floor, which is sort of the heartbeat of conference. So thank you again for having me. Looking forward to diving in.
Thanks, Murphy. I would highly recommend, if you haven't thought about going to the NACAC conference. I've been to, I don't know, over 20 of them. I think the very first one was in Minneapolis, so I can't even tell you what year that was. And you said they're going back to Minneapolis next year. That's exciting. But yeah, go check out the vendor hall. You'll find NACAC, all the different other organizations and vendors, and there's so much energy there. It's just such a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. So, and how many members did you say there are in NACAC? Run that number by us again.
28,000 and counting. I think as of this morning, it was like 28,641 across 65 different countries. So we're really happy to have such a large community of educators.
I think that makes a big difference, and expanding to a global perspective is so valuable. And I also want to reiterate what you said about being the organization for people on any side of the desk. So, we have counselors in private schools and public schools, community-based organizations, IECs, larger companies, tutoring companies, all sorts. And we're all serving the same purpose. We all have the same mission, and that's to serve the families and work with the students. So today you've brought some information. As you said, we did this presentation. If you saw it at HECA, there's a few updates, and it never hurts to reiterate things. But we have Murphy has some really good data to show you that impacts the admission trends. And when we have families, the reason it's important, first of all, it's our job to know some of this information. But more importantly, families ask us these questions. And so when we have data and that you have for NACAC, that helps give us tools and resources that we can provide to families and put it in a context. And I think that's really important as well. Put it in the international context or, whatever community I'm in California. So for me to be able to put it in a California context, that's an important aspect. So and you can see, Murphy, we've got quite a few people from all over. I've had everybody put in their names and locations. And Allison, I hope you're going to the conference because it is in Columbus, Ohio, right? Isn't that where it is?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we can have Allison there. She's going to be there. She's been in some of my classes. So glad to have everybody here today. Let's learn more about your the data and the admission trends.
Great. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully that pops up easily for everyone. Can everyone hopefully can see that? So as Cyndy was mentioning, this presentation is really all about trends and data. We put this together a number of years ago based off of member feedback saying that they really needed insights to back up the expertise that they were providing to the students and families that they served. So this is really built out of member feedback. And of course, it's been updated consistently over the years because we've really been kept on our toes the last number of years. Feels like every day there's a new development related to college admission counseling or higher ed more broadly. So we work really diligently. Our research team works hard at it. Our education and training team works hard at it. We want to make sure that this information is up to date and relevant to you all. And again, it's born out of this idea that we understand that you need data and trends to understand what's happening across the landscape and to sort of cut through the noise. I think what's great about college admission counseling is that there are so many folks in our field, but that also creates a lot of noise, right? And so the goal of this presentation is to kind of cut through that noise and give you the facts and figures and trends that you really need to understand. So ideally, after attending this session, we hope you can identify the latest trends impacting college admissions and higher ed more broadly. Hopefully, it increases your ability to serve students so you can integrate some data-informed insights. Hopefully, you can better discuss the future of college admission counseling and the broader landscape. And then selfishly, my hope is that you'll be able to better understand the benefits of NACAC in terms of our research, our professional development, our membership advocacy, and publications. The other thing I always like to mention about this presentation is we understand how difficult it is to get pushback sometimes from the students and families that you serve. I had a boss one time who said, everyone thinks they're an expert when it comes to education because we've all gone to school. So we understand sometimes, your expertise is questioned, even though you've worked hard to hone your skills. And so the data presented here is meant to back up the support that you're providing to students and families. Before we dive into the data, though, I did want to create some context around who you're hearing from, who we are as an organization. So the National Association for College Admission Counseling was founded in 1937. We are a nonprofit, non-governmental membership organization devoted to college access. We support any professionals in the college admission counseling field and anyone who touches college admission counseling. So our members are school-based counselors, admissions officers at universities, independent educational consultants, CBOs, nonprofit organizations, corporate organizations that work within the field of college admission counseling. So it's a very broad-based network, and we're really excited to have such a diverse member base. We offer a variety of different kind of programming and services and areas of support. So, of course, you have the member experience where we unlock best-in-class research and publications and connection and opportunity for engagement. We also offer a series of training and education programs. So if you like what you hear today, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We have a lot of other programming available to you all focused on college admission counseling. We also do a lot of policy and advocacy work. I will note we are a nonpartisan organization, but we do have very specific policy objectives around education, around accessing higher education, around creating access to the transformative power of post-secondary education. So we are guided by those policy initiatives. We also host a number of events and conferences. We talked about our annual conference, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, but we also offer other events throughout the year, both in person and virtually. And we are proud to be the publisher of the Guide to Ethical Practice in College Admission. If you're not already familiar with this document, I would definitely encourage you to familiarize yourself with it. It is a best practices document. Essentially, it is written out to encourage goodwill, best practices, trust, and ethics as it relates to the university search and application process. So it speaks not only to counselors and university admissions officers, but also how students and families should be engaging in an ethical way as it relates to university search and application process. So if you ever find yourself in sort of a tricky scenario, like a student is asking, I know I applied early decision, but is that really binding? You can seek out information in the Guide to Ethical Practice in College Admission. And I will also note that NACAC hosts an admission practices committee. So they are responsible for doing updates to the guide. There's a form on our website that you can submit to them. If you experience something that you think isn't quite a best practice, we are here to help and help you kind of mediate those scenarios. I will note we just in the last couple of weeks published a brand new version of the guide, which does include some provisions around the use of AI in the university search and application process. So even if you're familiar with this document, I would encourage you to check back because there are additional provisions there and a few other updates. So this is a living, breathing document. And really, as it relates to AI, our guidance is fairly broad because we recognize high schools and universities and organizations are going to create their own policies. But our hope is that we can kind of set a framework by which folks can use AI in an ethically and responsible way. So our mission at NACAC is to empower college admission counseling professionals through education, advocacy, and community. And our vision is that the transformative power of post-secondary education is accessible to all who seek it. And I also want to note that we have 23 regional affiliates. So NACAC is sort of an umbrella organization, and under that organization, we have our 23 regional affiliates. So I would encourage you to familiarize yourself with your regional affiliate. Could be based off of your state, it could be based off of a region of the US, or it could be the International Association for College Admission Counseling. So a few different options. I think it's great when folks are engaged both with their regional affiliate and with NACAC. I think they serve sort of different purposes, even though we are very much aligned in a common goal, which is to empower you with education and training and resources. We also all abide by NACAC's Ethical Guide to College Admission. But really, the idea is that it offers broader representation from a geographical standpoint. I also think sometimes if you're looking to get involved with an association, doing it at the regional level is a great place to start. And then maybe one day, you can be involved with NACAC at the national level. So definitely look up your affiliate, get involved if you're not already. They host wonderful programming throughout the year in all different shapes and sizes. So we love our affiliates. And because there's been so much going on as of late, and we've really been kept on our toes as a profession, we thought it would be important to kind of talk about NACAC's values and advocacy before we dive into the data we'll be covering today. We understand that every day feels like a different journey, and there's a lot going on. And we want you all to know that as an association, we're monitoring all executive orders, all policy proposals, all mandates, all legislative developments and rulings. We're very lucky at NACAC to have a robust full-time staff, including folks who are devoted to our advocacy work. But we also work with Education Council as a partner and collaborator. That is a law firm that has extensive experience in civil rights legislation, specifically around education. And we host monthly community conversations to discuss some of the challenges that our current profession faces. So if you haven't joined us for those, definitely encourage you to do so. They're really enlightening. And again, another way in which you can kind of cut through the noise and make sure that you're separating fact from fiction, because we know how, information can sometimes distort. Our goal is to help you understand exactly what's going on. Of course, throughout, we want to ensure that we're providing guidance to our members and that our support will be both strategic and calculated. So some of the work that you see NACAC doing in the advocacy space will be very loud and obvious. And some of our work will be done more quietly. And that is for very specific reasons. But generally speaking, we want folks to know that we won't move away from upholding our mission and values, which I've already outlined here. We actively communicate with members of Congress to remind them of our values and our policy priorities. And we also share our members' stories of impact. Now, this is really critical. We do have a survey that NACAC members and non-members can submit, which give you the opportunity to share stories about how potentially federal actions could be impacting you and your students and the work that you do. When we are advocating on behalf of the profession, it's really helpful when we can point to specific stories or anecdotes to help tell a more powerful story about how this is having a trickle-down impact on professionals and on students. We understand that the headlines we are seeing all the time mean very real things for your students, and we feel that there might be a bit of a disconnect between what students want and need and what the current administration is focused on. We haven't seen a lot of positive movement in the college access space, and although we always remain hopeful. And I did want to provide a QR code to our Take Action page. So this kind of aggregates all of our advocacy initiatives at NACAC and includes a link to the survey if you want to fill out a personal story, professional story to help us advocate on your behalf. All right, now big themes in the field. There's a lot going on, as I mentioned, and this is something I feel like I have to update almost daily because things are changing so quickly. But we recognize that there are very real headwinds in higher education. There are lawsuits, there are federal actions, there is the diminishing of the Department of Education and staff who do everything from FAFSA to staff in the Office of Civil Rights. Higher education is at a very pivotal moment. I am always hesitant to use the word unprecedented because I think sometimes it can be overused, but also sometimes it can be very appropriate because what we're witnessing right now is definitely a pivotal moment for our field. And so we continue to monitor, as I've already discussed, and just know that this is something that we are actively looking at, advocating for, and trying to help you understand better. We've also seen an emphasis on flexibility and trying to remove barriers and sort of meet students where they are as it relates to the university search and application process. And I think the biggest example of this is the test optional movement, which collided with the COVID-19 pandemic and resulted in the vast majority of institutions across the United States adopting a test optional policy, essentially giving students the option as to whether or not they wanted to take the tests, as to whether or not they wanted to submit SAT or ACT scores. Really, significant barrier, especially for students who tend to be low income to access these tests, to perform well on these tests. And so we do see that as an example of removing barriers and potentially creating greater access for students. At the same time, we have very real concerns about access and affordability. We understand how expensive attending universities in the United States is. We also understand that sticker shock can be really, really crazy, really intense. and that oftentimes universities are offering really robust financial aid or merit scholarship programs. But the issue remains the same. Attending a university in the United States is very expensive, and there are very real issues related to access there. We also have an impending demographic shift, and we'll cover it a little bit more closely in a few slides from now. But essentially, this is the idea that the number of high school students graduating from high school, just the sheer head count, will be reducing for the first time in a very long time in this application cycle. So it's something that chief enrollment officers are thinking a lot about, and we'll talk a little bit more about momentarily. There's definitely a renewed or sustained focus on the core academic record, especially as it relates to the test optional movement, which we've already mentioned. And NACAC has some data that we'll share about the importance that the academic record plays in the university admission process that we'll share soon. There's also increased selectivity and more ambiguity among the ultra-selective or high-prestige brands, while simultaneously we have actually reduced selectivity and reduced yield amongst the vast majority of institutions. And this is really outlining a theme that we're going to see time and time again throughout this presentation. It's sort of a story of the haves and the have-nots when it comes to universities. So ultra-selective institutions that tend to be really well-known and tend to be really well-resourced are doing just fine. They're receiving high numbers of applications. They're enrolling in their class. They're seeing success. More regional institutions, less selective institutions, perhaps less well-known institutions, less well-resourced institutions are not experiencing that same reality. And the dichotomy seems to only be growing. So this is something that is of great interest to us. We want to continue to track it, and we want to ensure that we're kind of shifting the narrative, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. We also have updated enrollment data after the COVID-19 pandemic. We were pretty concerned about student enrollment. So application numbers looked strong, but actually matriculation was a separate story. There were a lot of kind of barriers during the pandemic related to finances, related to mental health, and that had trickle-down impacts on student enrollment. And we continue to track enrollment data because we know how important that is. It's not just about applying, it's actually about matriculating, attending, and then retaining and being successful. We also understand that a lot has happened in the FAFSA world, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the updates there, things to be mindful of. And of course, we understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that has been in the headlines and a place where we see headwinds as well. It is something that is really important to NACAC as an organization, but we know that things are really shifting as it relates to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the United States and in higher ed more specifically. So those are some of our big themes. Cyndy, I don't know if anything jumps out at you or if there's something that you would add to this list of themes as a practitioner.
I think it's pretty comprehensive, Murphy. These are the things that we get, view and get asked about all the time and are concerned about. So I think that's enough.
So it's good that we're covering them today. That's great. So now we're going to dive into the data, and this is one of our favorite quotes at NACAC. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion, right? So we talked earlier about this idea that sometimes your expertise is questioned by students or family members. And so having data to back up the guidance that you're providing, we know it's very critical. And that's exactly what this presentation was designed for. So let's start with the application data. And I want to mention that this data is specifically harvested from our friends at the Common Application. We work very closely with the Common App throughout the year. And if you're not familiar with their reporting, it is really wonderful and very robust. It all exists on their webpage under Reports and Insights, I think. But I do want to note, while a lot of universities are on the Common Application, it is not an exhaustive list, right? And so this Application data is demonstrative of the over 1,000 universities on the Common Application, but of course it does not include data, for instance, from the University of California system or the California State University system. But we do still find that this data is a pretty strong sample size and can give us some insights in terms of application trends. So I always like to put it out there for any of you sort of methodology nerds. This is not exhaustive, but it is certainly demonstrative. So the 2024-2025 application cycle witnessed a 41% increase in applications when compared to pre-pandemic levels. So from the 2019-2020 cycle to this past cycle that we just experienced, a 41% increase in applications. It's up 5% just from last cycle, but a lot of that growth happened throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what we're really seeing there is, number one, more students applying because they can apply test optional. That reduces a barrier as part of the university application process. And so I think students are more likely to apply to, university because that barrier is removed. What we're also seeing is an increase in the number of applications submitted per student. So I always talk about, gone are the days where students are submitting applications to 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 thoughtfully well-crafted university choices. Now it is much more common that students are submitting 10, 12, 15, 20 applications per cycle. I have given this presentation in the past to an audience, and someone chimed in and said that they had a student submit or create 2 Common Application accounts, because the Common App does limit you to 20 applications. They created 2 separate accounts with 2 separate emails so they could submit 40 applications. Now, that would not be advisable. If I were their counselor, I would say, I don't know if there are going to be 40 universities that are going to be a great fit for you, but I do want to give students some credit here. I want to recognize that I think the narrative right now is that universities are impossible to get into. And I think there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of animosity. And so I feel like they're submitting more and more applications because they're worried about whether or not they're going to find a home for the next 2 or 4 years, right? So they're kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and thinking, figuring out what's going to stick. And that's rooted in anxiety. What also happens in that dynamic is that with more applications submitted per student, universities have a more difficult time understanding who's actually going to enroll, right? Because when students are submitting 20 applications, it's really difficult to anticipate where they're actually going to choose to attend. And we'll talk a little bit more about yield data in just a minute. Applications from outside the US leveled off this past cycle after significant gains over the past 5 years. I think a lot of this is likely due to some of the, political rhetoric here in the US. Now, obviously, when students were submitting applications, early decision, the election would have been fresh. Regular decision, inauguration hadn't yet happened, but obviously we know who was going to be president. And so some of this could be caused from a cooling as a result of our current political circumstances in the US. I think the real thing that we're looking at very closely now is with some of the policy decisions that have been made over the last 6 months, with some of the delays that have been significant in international students accessing US F1 visas, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of students actually coming to campuses. There have been some reporting saying it could be anywhere from a 40 to 50% decline in terms of students who are actually arriving on their campuses. As I mentioned, I was recently in Delhi, India, and the local consulate was reporting 3 visa appointments per day, which of course is not enough in any given year, but particularly because visa appointments were being paused for a great portion of the month of May, there's a backlog, right? So we're very concerned about the impact all of this will have on international students, and that's definitely something we're watching closely. In more positive news, in this last application cycle, we did see a 12% increase in underrepresented minority applications and a 13% increase in first-generation applications, so students for whom they are the first in their family to attend college. We also saw significant increases in the number of students demonstrating fee waiver eligibility, which is also important to us from an access perspective. And larger, more selective universities experienced greater year-over-year application increases. So again, this comes back to this idea that the more selective you are, or the more brand name recognition you have, the better off you're going to fare when it comes to student interest. Applications to public universities grew at a faster rate than private, 11% versus 3%. And growth in applications to the most selective was slowest in the past few years at just 3% growth. In previous years, we had seen really significant growth for the most selective. So it does indicate that maybe that's beginning to cool ever so slightly when you look at the most ultra selective universities. Cyndy, I know when we talked about this together last time, you had a takeaway, but I don't want to put you on the spot, but just curious if you have any thoughts related to this application data.
As I'm looking at this, I'm kind of wondering, in particular, what prompted the increase in underrepresented minority applications in first gen, because so much of the other almost points away from that.
I
And
know.
having worked in Avid and worked in a program for underrepresented students, I'm glad to see that, but I'm wondering what might have contributed to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I would say is that Common Application has done a really great job with outreach. They're also um, piloting a number of direct admissions programs, which I think could
Mhm.
be helping to create greater access for students. And then I would also say, we're continuing to see gains in this area related to the test optional movement.
Mhm.
We'll talk a little bit about the role of standardized testing and where we kind of are in the field, but I still think removing that barrier for the vast majority of institutions is causing greater access for this particular population.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think those are very key things. And I would ask the audience, what would you say the average number of applications that your students complete or submit? It would be interesting to see what people say that what the numbers are that they
I'd be very
so,
curious.
uh,
7 to 10. I
and
live in
Sharon,
Texas as well.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, some people do get upset because they can only do 20 on the Common App. And here in California, that's not a big problem because we can apply to University of California, all the campuses, all the CSUs, and the Common App. That's, well, I don't know what, over 60 campuses, colleges. That would be crazy. That would be just crazy.
And
Um,
it's interesting to me, the UK system uses a platform called the UCAS. And even, I mean, they have 146 universities, so not nearly as many as the US, but they limit their students to 5 applications or 5 programs, academic programs, which is interesting.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. We're seeing lots of great numbers. And Sharon brings up a good point too. Having the big public schools join the Common App sure probably has contributed to the application numbers and international. There's so many international schools too that have joined. And I know a lot of states have started. Utah, I'm sure there are other states that are doing more direct admit, like they're trying to recruit more of their in-state students to keep talent in state. And so they're offering more direct admissions from that too.
Yeah, good point. So if it's okay, let's dive into the factors conversation. For many years, NACAC has solicited a survey and done research around how universities make their admission decisions, and we call it factors in admission decisions. So we reach out to our members, we ask them to let us know, what do you weight as most important, or what are you looking for as part of your admissions evaluation process? Now, this past year, we decided to do something different and also survey students. So this slide is demonstrative of student responses. Over 1,000 students responded. They had to let us know out of a list of different factors in the admission decision, or a list of different aspects of the application process. What do you think universities think is most important, right? And they could only choose 5. So they could choose from things like, demonstrated interest, the interview, grades in college prep courses. Um, as you can see here in the graph, they felt like grades in all courses and admission test scores, so standardized testing, were by far the most important factors in the admissions evaluation process, followed by extracurriculars, essay, grades in college prep courses, right? Strength of student course load, only 26% of folks reported that they felt like that was a super important part of the application process. And counselor recommendations falls to the bottom of the list when students are asked about the importance of their role in the admission review process. So it's interesting to see how students are interpreting and internalizing the university review process. Let's look at what our universities actually reported. So this is survey data from our member institutions letting us know what they're actually using to evaluate candidates. And essentially, we would have them report back like, is this of considerable importance, moderate importance, limited importance, and so on. And so what you can see here is consistently academic achievement in the classroom is the most are the most important factors in the college application evaluation process. And so that includes grades in all courses, grades in college prep courses, and the strength of curriculum, which students really kind of underestimated the role that curriculum review played in their application review process. And then you have positive character attributes, which obviously come from a variety of qualitative sources. Could be the essay, could be extracurriculars, could be that counselor recommendation. You have the essay and writing sample. What's interesting to us is that admission test scores, only 4.9% of respondents indicated that was of considerable importance. And I will say back in the day, I'd say probably around 2018, 2017, admission test scores had a much higher standing on this list. And it sort of dropped down again as a result of this test optional movement colliding with COVID-19. And so that's a really interesting factoid and something students have not necessarily picked up on, even though universities are saying we really are test optional, students aren't necessarily internalizing that, right? Which is part of why recently we did the campaign, Test Optional Really Means Test Optional, where deans of admissions signed on the dotted line confirming, yes, when we say we're test optional, we really mean we're test optional. And we saw, really great responses from university admissions offices. The other thing I would like to note here is that counselor recommendation comes out. If you add up considerable importance and moderate importance, basically about 43% of respondents are saying it's either of considerable or moderate. So it still plays an important role. And there again, students are underestimating the value of that letter of recommendation. I do want to note, because I always get this question, subject test scores appear here on the bottom. I want to note that those are your actual exam results. So that's not your performance in the classroom if you're in an AP curriculum or an IB curriculum. It's actually your performance on the exams themselves, which typically students will send or not send. And some universities look at them and some of them do not. Depending on where you are in your curriculum, universities might only be receiving those after you've already deposited, right? So they don't play a huge role in the admission process. That's not to say that they might not play a role in terms of reviewing the rigor of your curriculum in terms of what APs you're taking or how your IB curriculum looks. So I always like to point that out because we tend to get questions there. So in short, students overemphasize the role of admission test scores. They underemphasize the role of strength of curriculum, and I would also add letters of recommendation, but they've accurately assessed the importance of grades in all courses. So they understand that they need to be doing well in their courses, but they're not necessarily making that connection to the rigor of that curriculum.
Murphy, did the surveys include what people think the cost of college is? I know in the past surveys have been done and families often overestimate the true cost of college.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I know other peer associations have published some data on that. We didn't have that as part of this survey, but we've definitely amplified data around what the national average cost of tuition is or cost of attendance is. And I think it was NCAN that published a really great report on basically, the landscape more broadly and helping folks understand that that sticker price that you see might not actually, usually, almost always, isn't the exact price that you're paying between need-based financial aid and merit-based scholarships.
And what's NCAM?
Oh, sorry. National College Attainment Network.
Okay.
Thank you. Sometimes we speak in alphabet soup at NACAC, so I'm always
Oh,
helpful.
that's education in general.
Yeah. So let's talk about some selectivity data, and this comes directly from NACAC as well. This is something that we've been tracking for many years now. Essentially, again, we're asking our university members to report out to us what was your admit rate this year, and we tabulate all of that and we analyze it. I do want to note we control, of course, for open enrollment institutions. So this is not demonstrative of any institutions that admit 100% of their incoming class. We do only survey institutions that have some semblance of selectivity as part of their application review process. And so as you can see here, the average admit rate when looking across the United States is 73%. Now, the point that I always make is if you were talking to a student or their family and you ask them, what do you think the average admit rate is? What do you think they would say? I mean, 10%, 15, 25, 30, 40. I think very few students and families would say that the average admit rate in the United States is 73%. And I think part of that is because oftentimes in the media and in cocktail party conversations, we talk about the same usual suspects. In fact, the New York Times last year reported that it was the most competitive admissions season on record. We actually see the average admit rate in the United States going up. So universities on the whole are actually becoming less selective. And part of this is because there's less predictability around yield, the percentage of students who are going to choose to attend their campus, because students are applying to more universities, right? So the admit rate actually has to be higher just to be able to build your class because there's less of an ability to understand if the student's going to enroll, right? But universities over time have actually become less selective. And as you can see here, this graph shows us average number of applicants by accepted rate ranges. So 1 to 10, universities that admit 1 to 10% of students are receiving the vast majority of applications. Now, obviously, the way that works out from a calculation standpoint makes sense, right? They're receiving more applications, they're admitting fewer students, right? But I think what that also suggests is that in the US, we're conflating selectivity with quality or fit. Students are much more interested in applying to a university that is perceived as highly selective, because I think, again, we are conflating selectivity and quality when we know as educators that's not the truth, right? And I know Cyndy and I talked about with our colleague Stefano from Lynn, there's a really great article from Forbes that talks about how, first of all, success takes many shapes and sizes. And second of all, your university choice has very little to do with that outcome. It's more about how you take advantage of that experience. And I think it goes on to report that the vast majority of Fortune 500 company CEOs didn't necessarily attend the usual suspects, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and many of us will pull up a list of, celebrities or CEOs and shows like, this one went to the school in Appalachia or whatever. And it's really encouraging when we have authors like Jeffrey Salingo and Frank Bruni and, many others that are sharing that too. So, but we're preaching to the choir right here, right?
Surely.
I mean, we all know that, but it's even more difficult when you're trying to not only just convince US, but international. I mean, so many international families and students think the US News and World Report rankings is a government ranking.
Yeah. Yep. It's true. And in my conversations with international students when I lived overseas, it was typically like, I'm only going to go to the US if I can get into XYZ university. And that's a
Yep.
very big part of the conversation. So, my hope in sort of sharing this admit rate figure, though, is hopefully it can kind of bring the temperature down in the room. Again, going back to the student anxiety that I think that they face when they're hearing from reputable sources like the New York Times, not to call them out because lots of media sources do it, but when they're hearing most competitive admission season on record, that's giving them anxiety, right? And so sharing this figure that says, well, actually, the average admit rate across the United States is 73%. And actually, the average admit rate over time, universities have become less selective. So we've been tracking this since 2012 when the average admit rate hovered around 64%. Now it's hovering around 73%. Right. So even though you're hearing it's impossible to get into college, you're never going to find a home for the next 4 years. The reality is, if you keep your options open, if you have an open mind, you will find a home for the next 4 years. There are places for you because it's not as competitive as we think, but we continue to focus on the same set of colleges and universities. And I mentioned earlier how this is, the number of applications submitted per student is having a direct impact on university yield. So, yield rates have gone down, selectivity rates have gone up. You have to admit more students to build your class. Your yield becomes less certain. And, I think when I worked in admissions, we would sit around a conference table. We would make very intentional decisions around which students we're going to admit. We would send out the admit letters, and then we would hope and pray that the students we admitted would choose us. And then you realize that your livelihood is dependent on the decision-making process of a 17-year-old, which is a little bit of a scary thought. But we know that universities are having to be more strategic. We know that universities are having to employ a variety of different enrollment management tactics in order to be able to build their class. And there's been a lot of talk about the rise of early applications, early decision, restrictive early action. A lot of that is in response to the fact that it can be so difficult to understand the decision-making process of students. Again, as they submit more and more applications, it's less and less certain as to where they're actually going to enroll. I think that's another reason why demonstrated interest has also become a little bit more common. Universities tend to be somewhat more open about reporting whether they track it, but I think they're also using it at a higher rate. And then the supplemental essays are also being utilized as a proxy for understanding, interest and intention to enroll. And I think it is all a strategy for them just to be able to build their class, because things are a lot more uphill than they used to be for universities. Now, everyone's favorite topic is standardized testing. And so let's talk a little bit about the figures. So when we looked at this last application cycle, 5% of Common App institutions required standardized testing, which was up 1% of the previous cycle. And again, not to gang up on the media, but I will say there's a lot of articles, especially last fall, that said we're returning to testing. But again, those typically were the usual suspects when we think about universities. And actually, in total, actually using IPEDS data, which I think I have on the next slide, only 7.2% of universities require standardized testing for admissions. Now, I want to be very clear that that is for admission. That does not count any universities who might be using it for their honors program or might be requiring it for certain merit-based scholarships. That's simply for admission. But again, it still stands that the vast majority of institutions across the United States have test optional policies. In this last application cycle, approximately half of the applicants reported their test scores, and this year actually marks the first year of growth in score sends. So we had been hovering around 40%, then it was 40 or 45%, and we did see a growth to just under 50% of students reporting their test scores. We do see far higher average reporting rates among applicants living in more affluent communities. We do know that there is a very clear connection between median family income and performance on standardized testing. And actually, I'll say I worked for a university, and at the time, we became the largest private university to be test optional. We did not make that decision lightly. We put a lot of intentionality behind it. And of course, we tracked students' performance after they enrolled. And at least in this particular circumstance, we did not see any significant change in academic performance on campus between submitters and non-submitters. And the other thing that we saw is that standardized testing, again, was more closely aligned with your median family income than it was aligned with academic performance on campus. So that is just one campus community. I'm not saying that that is necessarily demonstrative of every campus community, but I do think it's interesting insight to have as we think about the testing landscape. We also know first-gen and underrepresented minority applicants were less likely to report test scores, though growth in those groups was noteworthy. It did occur in the last cycle, but they were in general less likely to report scores. Students were more likely to submit test scores to selective institutions. I would imagine the thinking there is like, oh, well, it's a super selective institution, so of course they're going to want to see test scores. So I'm going to submit them whether my scores align with their median score range or not, right? And I will also say I understand that median score range now in the test optional environment is so difficult, right? Because it's totally skewed now that a lot of students are not submitting, but that's a tale for another time. And of course, we continue to track the landscape. And one of the ways that we do that is through IPED's data. So this is publicly available data. And you can see here that 7.2% of institutions at this point in time are requiring test scores for admission. And the number of schools who are returning to testing was only 6.6%. So really not huge numbers, but again, when you focus on the usual suspects, the highly selectives, you might have noticed some movement in this last cycle or two related to that. And I promised I would talk a bit about the FAFSA because, again, really important, want to understand what's happening across the board. So I think we all remember not this past cycle, but the cycle beforehand, the Department of Education was tasked with updating the FAFSA. I will say, at the time, even they weren't properly staffed to do such a robust rollout. They also weren't properly funded to do such a robust rollout. So it was a bit of a disaster, as I'm sure many of you all know, but I do want to recognize that they weren't necessarily set up for success. And so, really the intention was to streamline and simplify the free application for federal student aid. Obviously, that didn't happen 2 years ago. This past cycle, things looked quite a bit better, right? We had fewer questions. We replaced the estimated family contribution with a student aid index, so swapping EFC for SAI. They expanded Pell eligibility, at least for now, which is a very positive thing. There's a robust integration with the IRS for quicker data retrieval for tax information related to the FAFSA form. So all of that is good. And I will say in this past cycle, the percent of high school seniors who completed the FAFSA was significantly higher than it was the year prior. So that is really positive. But we also recognize that right now, with everything happening in the current administration, there's unprecedented uncertainty, to use that word again. We have fewer folks in the Department of Ed office. And so we are hearing reports of delayed responses, not getting, information when students and families are reaching out. And that is a very real issue. Our biggest fear is that when students can't complete this process, they might fall out of the pipeline forever. And that's exactly what we do not want. There's also delays in getting data to universities, and this happened even in this past cycle. So this is really critical because it delays financial aid packaging on the part of universities. So you may have found with some of your students that they weren't getting financial aid packages in sort of the same quick manner that they had in previous years. And so with fewer folks working at the Department of Ed office, we worry that that will continue. So these headwinds in higher ed will probably also trickle down to financial aid dollars. And Cyndy and I were talking about, UCLA, which has already come out and said, with this funding potentially being taken away, that's going to have very real impacts on the research we can do, of course, but also other things like, student life access to mental health, access to financial aid, not just for that institution, but for all these institutions that have been in sort of the crosshairs. And so that is of definite concern. And then we also know that they've introduced caps on how much students can borrow, which I understand. We understand. We don't want folks borrowing too much, right? And then not being able to kind of dig themselves out. But we also know that there are specific programs that are just a lot more expensive and that students might have to borrow more to access those programs. So I think there are concerns around rigidity there. If a student, for instance, is trying to access a specific program in the health sciences that tend to be more expensive, and yet they have this cap on what they can borrow, even if their earning potential might be greater, right? So there are questions and concerns around that. And of course, this continues to evolve, and we will continue to provide guidance. Also want to touch on the enrollment shift, and I know we're short on time, and we want to be able to answer some questions too. So I'll try to do this quickly. But I mentioned earlier that the sheer number of high school students will begin to decrease starting in this application cycle. This is a direct cause of the 2008 recession. So there was a lot of uncertainty, financially speaking, in 2008. And so folks made different decisions from a family planning perspective. And that is now catching up to us. So for the first time in a very long time, we are going to witness a decrease in the number of students graduating from high school. Now, it is not even across the country, and that's why we call it the enrollment shift and not necessarily the enrollment cliff. So there are going to be some places where the population increases. So DC, where I reside, we're actually going to see a 31% increase in the number of students graduating from high school. But then you compare it to Hawaii, which will see a 33% decrease. Also want to note that the number of Latinx Hispanic students will actually increase. So when you look at specific demographic information for these students, they're going to be, shifts. It's not even across the board. Generally speaking, though, we do anticipate a 15% drop in first-year prospects beginning in 2025, so beginning in this year, which means very real things, especially for universities that are already struggling to build their classes. However, demand for elite institutions is forecasted to fare much better than more regional four-year colleges and universities. Regional institutions are expected to lose 11% of their students by 2029, whereas if demand for elite institutions continues to trend in the way that we've been seeing, despite the fact that the number of students graduating from high school will be decreasing, if the demand continues on the current trend, elite institutions may be up to 14% higher in 2029 than in 2012. So interesting stuff here. Nathan Graw from Carleton College is sort of the leading expert on the enrollment shift or the enrollment cliff. So I encourage you to check out his work. It's really interesting. So in putting this presentation together, we like to survey members and we receive a lot of really great feedback. But one of the best bits of feedback we got was just this GIF. We understand that this is probably how you feel a lot of the time. There's a lot going on. There are a lot of shifts. There are a lot of changes, and you're just trying to support your students as best as you can. And we're here for you to support you. So just wanted to point that out. And end on a high note, which is that the value of higher education has never been greater. I know that there's some uncertainty around, should I get a degree or should I just become a TikTok star and make six-figure salaries, right? The return on investment in a degree is still there. So if you think about kind of return on investment, the financial return is there. But the other thing that we like to note is if you attend at least a bachelor's degree education, you're more likely to volunteer, you're more likely to be civically engaged, you're more likely to vote. So there are other really important aspects to our society that higher education brings. So I like to end on that note because I know folks are consistently having that conversation around, okay, well, what's in it for me? What's the return on investment? And here you can show financially, but there are also other qualitative factors as well.
Especially with Gen Z, that is a big
Yes.
aspect of it. Yeah.
I know, I get it. So we've already talked about the conference. We would love to have you join us in a couple of weeks in Columbus. It will be great to see those of you who are already registered there. If you're not already a NACAC member, sign up to learn more. We think it's a great experience. I'm pretty biased. Cyndy is probably less so, but I know she's a long-serving NACAC member, and we're very grateful. We also offer lots of education and training. So,
Yeah.
and NACAC fairs. But I want to make sure we get to questions, and I know we're pretty much at time. So,
Well, we have a few minutes. And just a couple of questions, but I want to just reiterate what you said in the very beginning about looking up your regional and being involved at a regional level, and then also being involved at the national level. I think that's so key. That's so important. And I put a link in the chat to the affiliates, the regional affiliates, so that you can look that up and find out where you are if you don't already know. And one of the biggest groups is the International Association for College Admission Counselors, which is an affiliate of NACAC. And I think sometimes people don't know that. So that's another really good thing. So how often is this report updated? So the question is, does NACAC plan to update this report soon? So is this done on a rotating schedule, or what's the frequency?
great question. So the presentation itself, we update anytime we have any new piece of information or data. So I would say the presentation is probably updated in some way, shape, or form, like every couple of weeks. But in terms of the NACAC produced data, I recognize that we haven't released new data now in a couple of years. It kind of depends on what area you're looking at. But I know our research department is working diligently to update that. The other thing I would say is we are about to be able to release an even broader swath of data insights. And so we're very excited for that. I can't say much more about what that is, but I will say you will be very pleased in the way that we're able to package and release data that really has an impact on the work that you do. So
sounds like another Friday forum to me, Murphy.
yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. So we're excited about that development and just stay tuned. But we have a research department. They do a variety of different projects. And so they work as hard as they can to update it. And so it does depend, but a lot of it lives on the website. And then the presentation itself gets updated regularly.
Mm-hmm. So one other question, do you have any data or thoughts on why many highly selective schools went to their wait list, like in as late as July or August? Was it because of international enrollment drop?
I mean, I can't speak for every university, but I can tell you what I've heard anecdotally is that in some cases it was exactly that. I think a lot of international students, whether it was because they were having a hard time getting a visa appointment or whether they were seeing things happening in the US that didn't necessarily align with their values, they chose alternative options. And I know that there was a lot of chatter in the international counseling community around my student doesn't want to go to the US anymore. What options do they have, right? Or my student can't get their visa. What options do they have? So I do think some of that waitlist activity likely is a direct impact on that international student impact from that international student population behavior. But we also know every year is different, right? That seems to change. So yeah, but I think that's a safe assumption.
Yeah, I think so. And I put in the chat a link to the Common App reports. Like, I didn't know those existed. So now I will add those to my class, my UCLA class. And I noticed the latest one was published August 11th. So it's not even a month old. Yeah, so I would recommend people go to those data sources. And then there's other questions. If somebody has more questions, specific questions, like Jeffrey's asking about visas and things like that, where would be the best place to go to get those kind of answers?
Yeah, so we work in consultation with a variety of peer organizations. One of them is NAFSA, which used to stand for something now it just is the International Educators Association. They are kind of the preeminent association that focuses on kind of visa related issues. They also have annual conferences. I went to their conference in San Diego in May. So we work very closely with them as it relates to kind of some of the work that's being done around visas and international students. And that is more their specialty. We definitely get a lot of questions around it, but we want to recognize that while it impacts college admission counseling, we're not, that is not necessarily our expertise or our lane. So we rely very heavily on NAFSA, and we are part of a larger coalition called the US for Success Coalition. So we get a lot of information from that we then amplify on our social media channels and our NACAC bulletin and in our member emails. So you'll definitely get some of that info from NACAC, but typically we're channeling it from other peer associations. So if you do have specific questions, definitely do check around international enrollment and or visa issues. NAFSA is kind of the preeminent association.
Great, great. Thank you. Thank you, Murphy. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I always appreciate that you spend your Friday just before the weekend here with me. And you can tell everybody has really enjoyed the information, the data. They're going to be looking forward to being able to have your presentation. It's already going to go into some slides for parents, like here's what you need to know. So it's such a valuable resource and such a valuable thing. And I look forward to bringing you back for this whole new thing. That sounds great, Murphy.
Yes.
So everybody join, no Friday Forum next week, but come back and we're going to have Hannah Bookbinder, and she's going to talk about working with ADHD students, unlock your inner superhero. She's an expert in that area. She also has just developed an app, which is just going gangbusters. She's getting all sorts of media attention. So she'll tell us about that. And then I have Harlan Cohen, who is also a big advocate for students. He wrote The Naked Roommate, and he's just a kick. He is such an advocate for students. He's going to come back and he's going to talk about the first year ever. So we're going to do that at the end of September. And then I have 2 sessions planned in October. I don't even have them up yet, but I will, on AI literacy. So, that's a whole other topic we could talk about, I'm sure. I attended a session that just talked about what's going to be on AI at NACAC. It was like, upcoming reels. So we're going to do one on AI literacy for adults. And this is with Jeffrey Neal from Graded in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and also literacy for students. And then Betsy Ellsworth is going to come talk about this little topic of financial aid, strategic enrollment management. So that's what we have in store for the future. So Murphy, have a great weekend. Everybody have a great weekend. I'll see you back here in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Cyndy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.